Chapter 7 Comorbidity. Comorbidity with other personality disorders distorts the pure clinical picture of avoidant personality disorder, AvPD. For example, Millen describes an avoidant passive-aggressive mixed personality, which adds a dimension of annoyance to the anxious withdrawal from others. Comorbidity alters the treatment approach to AvPD, and it does so in at least two ways. First, the therapist must treat all the disorders that constitute the final picture. Thus, while non-paranoid avoidants need to focus on, expose themselves to, and immerse themselves in relationships so that they can connect with others without becoming unduly anxious, paranoid avoidants need to start not with exposing themselves to relationships in the real world, but with rethinking their suspicious ideas about the real world to which they will hopefully soon be exposing themselves. Second, comorbidity determines the nature of and increases the number of resistances that crop up to impede therapeutic progress. Thus, avoidants who also in paranoid fashion wonder what did he mean by that, tend to be reluctant to think and act less avoidant just on the therapist say-so. Avoidants who are also depressed tend to resist therapy because they view the therapist's exhortations to do something as a criticism that they didn't already do it. Avoidants who are also masochistic tend to resist therapy because they respond to getting better by feeling worse. Avoidants who are also obsessive-compulsive tend to resist therapy because as stubborn individuals, they respond to therapeutic exhortations by taking one step backward to rethink, really undo every step they just took forward. Comorbid AvPD and paranoia. Here, the classic AvPD fire of sensitivity to the possibility of criticism, humiliation, and rejection is fueled by suspicion of what others might be thinking and up to. Such suspicion originates in large measure in a lack of basic trust resulting from projection, where I dislike myself becomes you feel antagonistic toward me and so must be out to get me. These avoidants primarily withdraw because they become wrongly convinced that others dislike or even hate them, as they view a cancellation of a date due to sudden illness as a personal rejection, an ogling look for a stranger, not as a come-on, but as a hostile stare, an offer of friendship or love as sexual harassment, an attempt to matchmake as trying to humiliate them for being so desperate that they need to be fixed up, and the best-intentioned advice, including that from a concerned therapist, as criticism for prior wrongdoing and or as an attempt to control them for the personal gain of the advisor. Projection also leads avoidants to unfairly blame others for their own need to withdraw. They weave the threads of their pathological fantasy, cognitive error, and the prophetic but unrecognized self-fulfilling consequences of their own provocative behavior into the cloth of external stress. Then, coming to view their inner anxiety as external fear, attribute their isolation and loneliness entirely to the machinations of the world around them. Illustrative, it is the familiar example of singles blaming their loneliness entirely on the absence of suitable partners where they live, when such a conclusion is in fact an illusion, created mainly out of their own problematic concept of suitability and a false distortive environmental assessment based on externalization of self-hatred to become others hate and avoid me. Beck's method of cognitive treatment, as revealed in taped interviews of sessions with a patient he calls Audrey, devotes itself in some measure to correcting paranoid blaming of others for having it in for me, as Beck shows Audrey how her withdrawal from others is in large measure a response to her belief that others are distancing themselves from her. Ultimately, paranoid avoidants even come to welcome their perceived stress, bad luck, or the nebulous incompatibility of everyone they meet, for it provides them with the excuse they are looking for to keep to themselves, the rationale they are seeking to distance themselves from others so that they can break free of them, exactly as they wanted to do all along. Comorbid AvPD and depression. While non-depressed avoidants fear not being loved, depressed avoidants become convinced that they can never be lovable. Their cry is, "What's the use of trying to relate to anyone? No one will want me." Now they become apathetic, give up, accept the hopelessness of things exactly as they imagine them to be, inure themselves to the rejections they feel are inevitable, and steel themselves to the predictable loneliness they are convinced is bound to be their fate, and as such will plague them throughout their lives. As self-demeaning individuals, depressed avoidants become like the depressed hardware store salesman who told self-deprecating jokes on his first date, how when handing out a flyer for his sale merchandise, he said, "Read this only if you are having difficulty sleeping at night." As guilty individuals, they feel that to err is inhuman, to forgive themselves unallowable. They view themselves as sinners, unworthy of loving themselves or being loved by others, partly based on a hypersensitivity to criticism that leads them to misinterpret a neutral question or positive remark as a personal devaluation, take a little joke as being seriously at their expense, or even interpret non-critical idiomatic expressions in a concrete, defamatory manner. To illustrate, I stopped using the expression "in case you haven't heard" to convey something positive. Everybody has heard it, so I'm sure you have too. Because several of my avoidant friends thought that I was being critical of them, as if I was saying that the reason they didn't hear of something was that they were completely, hopelessly, and stupidly deaf to the world. Some case examples. A shy, depressed, avoidant customer struggled to ask a salesperson in an upscale food store a question regarding the merchandise. The salesperson patiently explained his wares to her and then said, meaning it as a compliment, for he actually liked and took to this person, "I have never spent so much time with a customer before." The customer, being depressed as well as avoidant, thought he was criticizing her for taking up his whole afternoon. As a result, she complained to management that he had sassed her, then refused to return to the store ever again. A depressed avoidant emergency ward patient severely castigated members of the Department of Psychiatry for referring to her as a walk-in, a status she had convinced herself was somehow inferior to that possessed by those who have an appointment. In our interview, in the course of trying to assess the quality of her social life, I merely asked her, "Do you have many friends?" To this she replied that I was putting her down by criticizing her for being a loner, and was even implying that you are the sort of person that nobody could ever want. While non-depressed avoidants tend to confine their somatic complaints to those related to their anxiety, such as hyperventilation or tremor of the hands, depressed avoidants tend to develop a variety of off-putting messenger somatic complaints like the familiar not tonight, dear headache, Epstein-Barr, leave me be, chronic fatigue, or the physical weakness and need to retreat in order to rest, of hypoglycemia, all of which are their way to proclaim, I am withholding and withdrawing for physical reasons. A hypochondriacal fear of catching an illness often leads depressed avoidants to become remote due to worrying about contamination, especially from sexually transmitted diseases, another isolating curtain they draw around themselves, having come to feel that closeness is beyond emotionally precarious, is physically dangerous. For non-depressed avoidants, every new potential relationship promising a rosy future is a fresh sign of hope. For depressed avoidants, every new potential relationship recalling a dismal past is a new reason for despair. Comorbid AvPD and grief. Grievers pull back into themselves and avoid others because they feel pain so unbearable that it fully preoccupies them and saps their life energy. They also pull back out of a need to uninterruptedly chastise themselves about the bad things they guiltily believe they did to the lost loved one. Additionally, they pull back for more positive reasons, so that they may think of the person they lost full time and recreate the lost relationship inside of themselves. In their fantasies, then they stay remote, because coming to overvalue the lost object, they feel that no one new can ever match up to that person and take his or her place. Comorbid AvPD and obsessive-compulsive personality disorder. These avoidants tend to withdraw less out of fear than out of a need to maintain relational correctness, honor, and propriety. As perfectionists, they discard relationships because of others' minor flaws, doing so just because the other person has merely made a single insignificant social blunder, such as, you passed me on the crowded beach without even saying hello. They also remain remote because they fear making relational mistakes. As one individual describing her excessive perfectionism put it, "My record stands for itself. In my whole life, I never made a slip of the tongue, because I rarely speak so that I can avoid saying the wrong thing. For me, slips of the tongue are like wrong numbers. If you dial 1, you didn't get a wrong number. You dialed the number wrong." As worriers over nothing, they hurt relationships by subjecting them to constant evaluative questioning, always asking, "Can he or she be the only right one for me?" Then answering the question as maybe or maybe not. Then remaining aloof due to not knowing the correct answer. Uncertain as to whether they do or do not want to relate to others and to a given person, they tease, then disappoint, blowing hot and cold as they alternate between interest and detachment, playing Burns' game of kiss-off. As they beckon others to come, only to change their minds at the last moment and push them away should they actually arrive. A case example. One such man entered multiple chat rooms, then did not reply to the people who replied to him, or told them that he was busy now and couldn't take the time to get back. "But I will contact you, if only you will be patient." In singles bars, he dressed to look alluring, stood in sexy poses, and gave others seductive looks. Then, at the first sign of interest on the part of others, he became aloof and disdainful and removed himself, even though he was the one who had first extended the invitation. In his relationships, he said, "We must get together sometime," but never made a date, or making one broke it. reassuring the other person that this was the very last time that it would happen, just so that he could make it happen again. When having sex, premature withdrawal was the order of his day, not to prevent conception, but to first tempt and excite, then to frustrate by stopping short of fulfillment. Ultimately, he married to get away from home, but feeling unfaithful to his mother, divorced his wife so that he could go home again, only to complain about the single's life, about his inability to tolerate living with his mother, and about the difficulty older men have in meeting someone suitable and getting remarried. Eventually, he met someone who felt strongly attracted to, only to then take a job that required him to work every weekend and on holidays so that the few days he could take off were on non-holiday weekdays, which, not surprisingly, was the very time his new partner couldn't be at home with him. Non-obsessive avoidants are detached, distanced, and disinvolved partly because they have difficulty expressing their positive feelings. Obsessive avoidants can and do express their positive feelings, but only in situations where they can take them back, when they can express them paradoxically. That is, when others, having given up, no longer anticipate or are open to anything positive from them, or when they can express them indirectly, for example, to a person other than to the one who is the actual recipient of those feelings. Some case examples. One obsessive avoidant man gave negative responses to acquaintances' positive gestures, reserving his positive responses for when the gestures had been withdrawn, because the other person no longer cared and had chosen to move on. For many years, he had saved money by only having one date, never to repeat the experience because he became intensely angry when she ordered the most expensive item on the dinner menu. Then, later in life, after he saved a nice nest egg, he thought, it's time, and permitted himself to fall in love. Only now he found himself making bad investments in the stock market, thinking, better to lose it honestly than to have it taken away from you by some gold digger. Speaking of a new suitable man she had been seeing regularly for weeks, a patient said, "He's handsome, funny, very presentable, and I love how he deals with me, especially how he listens and remembers what I have to say. But it's really confusing. I see him one time, I like him. I see him the next time, I don't like him. He really wants me. I gave him my card and he called me right back. But I just cannot commit to him. I hear my mother's voice going around in my head saying, 'What are you holding out for? Someone who will treat you like a piece of crap?' It's the old story. You want the ones who don't want you, you don't want the ones who do." Anyway, my intense feelings for him completely disappeared when I discovered that his body type was all wrong for me. He doesn't have any body hair, and his legs are too short, a shock when you see him naked for the first time. So I started telling him negative things about myself, how after all I am not perfect and that right now I'm not going to object if he pushes for a relationship, but I'm not going to encourage one either. The final choice for this woman, a man who regularly criticized her for being a cheapskate, for saving money by using in-store coupons, something we just don't do in my family and where I come from. Additionally, obsessive avoidants are stubborn, controlling individuals. They may express this stubbornness in minor ways, for example, by sending belated birthday cards, with the additional element of a narcissistic shift in focus from your birthday to my having forgotten your birthday. Or in major ways as when they make an appointment, then cancel at the last minute. Caught up in control issues, they don't so much turn away out of fear as they run away out of need. They look for what others want in a relationship just so that they can refuse to give it to them, so that now they can gratify their need to be the one to call all the shots. Obsessive avoidants characteristically struggle with harsh matters of morality. They resolve their good versus evil struggles interpersonally by deeming others immoral so that they may now avoid them. While non-obsessive avoidants stay away out of a need to maintain safety, obsessive avoidants stay away out of a need to more closely approximate sainthood. Comorbid AvPD and hysterical histrionic personality disorder. Histrionic avoidants exaggerate the dangers associated with closeness, intimacy, and commitment. In the milder cases, a cancelled dinner date becomes a signal that the given relationship and every relationship to come is troubled and doomed. In the more severe cases, closeness becomes commitment, commitment becomes entrapment, and entrapment becomes fatal smothering to the extent that we hear. Freedom is completely out of the question within the bounds of a close, loving relationship. And complete freedom is what I want out of life, for I want to be me and I need to be free. Because of such fears, histrionic avoidants love unwisely, so that they do not have to love too well. They typically display that characteristic fear of closeness by avoiding suitable men in favor of attaching themselves to men about whom they have mixed feelings. Typically, they ignore a potentially workable relationship in favor of relationships that are likely to sputter or fail. Not only do they react negatively in positive situations, but they also react positively in negative situations, forming strong attractions where the possibility of fulfillment is weak, and vice versa, as they get turned off by those who are warm, yielding, permissive, and available, and turned on by those who are distant, unfeeling, forbidden, and unavailable. In their pursuit of negative situations and unavailable people, they sometimes become enamored of movie stars to the point of stalking them. Basically, they favor Oedipal triangular situations, pursuing people who are already involved with and committed to someone else, particularly almost divorced lovers who promise to leave their wives and marry them, but never actually do. All told, they suffer from what amounts to a fear of success, where they do attempt to relate, but only in those situations where they are virtually guaranteed to fail to do so. Comorbid AvPD and dissociative personality disorder. Avoidants who dissociate undergo flight, not only from the possibility or actuality of rejection, but also from the possibility or actuality of acceptance. When acceptance looms, they flee to the distant, remote, unfamiliar, foreign, strange terra incognito, where what they perceive to be the discomforts, harassments, and fears of the old world of relationships or of a specific relationship no longer pertain. If others approach them, they, in essence, tell them, "Corner me and I will retreat." Then pull the curtains around me, exclude you, and disappear out of what they perceive to be danger. They laugh off a serious approach or seduction that comes their way, so that any work they have done until now to promote a relationship evaporates, and the relationship comes to naught. Some, speaking of needing to take a break from an actual relationship, call for a hiatus early on. Others make it as far as the marriage ceremony, then at the last minute get cold feet, leaving their groom or bride at the altar. Some even have mini-fugues, consisting of detached, trance-like, and confused states in which they might view a potentially satisfactory relationship virtually as a terrorist attack. At times, they develop a chronic and persistent aloofness to others that is the product of their constant detaching themselves from feelings they perceive to be dangerous or forbidden by the expedient of removing themselves from other people who elicit those feelings. They also become aloof to themselves, not allowing themselves to feel through creating a protective remoteness inside that, in essence, says not, "I'm afraid you might find me uninteresting and will reject me, but I find you uninteresting and reject you." Ultimately, they calm down and once again become rational. As they become painfully aware of opportunity missed, now we hear recriminations about how they utterly ruined their lives and the lives of those who loved them. Unfortunately, however, their past regrets usually do not readily translate into improved future performance. Developmentally speaking, these avoidants often describe a past marred by constant parental warnings of the dangers of relating overall and of those associated with forming certain relationships specifically. For one little girl, the danger consisted of the loss of family, and for one little boy, the danger consisted of a symbolic castration as the father told his son that all marriage is a ball and chain around your ankle, just like the one with which your mother ties me down and ruins my life. Some case examples. A gay man who routinely dissociated when the big moment arrived, not registering it or registering it denying it, still remembers an incident 40 years ago, when a handsome sailor made it clear that he wanted him. But instead of replying in kind, he ignored him, sloughed him off, to use his words, laughed off the approach like a silly girl. He doesn't know why he did it, but he suspects it was because he became anxious. 40 years later, he was still bothered by his tactical error, still had fantasies of making it with a sailor, and still brooded. Was the pleasure dangerous, the pain desirable? Did I perceive danger, though there was none? See risk in the absence of a reason for concern? His only consolation, which he ceaselessly repeated to himself for a reassurance, was that had he gone with this sailor, he wouldn't have gone with the other man he met that night. And that was the man through whom he ultimately met his lifetime lover. A wistful patient announced his future plans to live his life by himself, camped alone under the stars in an adobe in the Arizona desert, on a farm with only the animals for companions, or on an island off the coast of Maine. The following two dreams regularly recurred during his childhood. He was running down a long corridor in order to escape an unknown danger. At the end of the corridor, an object variously described as the tassels of a riding crop, the straws of the head of a broom, and the feathered tail of a rooster appeared through the wall and shook at him, tracing an up and down trajectory. The sight of this terrified him, although he did not know why. He remained terrified until he progressed further along the corridor, when he saw a sign that read, "Safe to the left, danger to the right," whereupon he ran to the left and into the arms of safety. In the dream's aftermath, he wet his bed and awoke. In association to his dream, he recalled how one day, after his grandmother caught him playing doctor with a childhood sweetheart. She whipped him, then took him aside and showed him a picture from a Bible, a harp whose pillar was carved in the shape of a nude body of a man, genitals absent. The grandmother suggested that he would become that man if he continued to play such dirty little games. The shaking tassels, straws, rooster tail both represented his being whipped and the whip itself, and so both his threatened emasculation and the symbolic reassurance that his fellows were still there and intact. His running in the dream was both a running away from being whipped and emasculated and a running to a place of safety. In the second dream, there was a park over there, with skyscrapers arising intact from an excavation pit. His childhood sweetheart in reality lived on a street bordering the park. In the dream, he wanted to go there, but was afraid and couldn't find his way. And at any rate, he felt he didn't deserve to be there because he hadn't the right clothes. Ultimately, he arrived, only to discover her home had been bulldozed, and in its place another, taller structure, a skyscraper, had been erected. In his associations to this dream, he described himself as a distant and lonely avoidant, preoccupied with futile searching for new people whom he would like better, and for new places where he would be happier. In later life, he actually fled from city to city, looking for a relationship in a new place, even when many satisfactory relationships were available to him in the old one. On one occasion, he moved for no better reason than that in the new city, the skyscrapers were taller than in the old. The old city, without tall skyscrapers, referred to being devalued, punished, and emasculated for his sexuality now, just as he felt his grandmother had threatened to do to him when he was a kid. Fleeing to the new city, the park with big skyscrapers, and one big one in particular, represented a restitutive attempt to avoid or undo emasculation and become physically intact once again. Fleeing also represented heading to a place characterized by safety in numbers because a bigger city was more anonymous, a place where no one would know who I am and hurt and abuse me for what I do. For successophobic avoidance, dissociation is particularly suitable for acceptance emergencies, when by chance, bad luck, or in a moment of weakness, they find themselves in a potentially happy relationship they were unable to foresee and so avoid. In an unfortunate turn of events, the avoidant vanishing act often comes across to others as rejecting, even though it is not. For the dissociating avoidant is not being rejecting of, only protecting the self from rejection by others. Too often, this avoidance protective aloofness filters down from personal to impersonal pursuits with distortive results that affect choice of profession or choice of job within that profession. As a general principle, with plenty of individual exceptions, serious avoidants tend to become physicists, even when they really want to become doctors. And within the medical profession, anesthesiologists, even when they really want to become psychiatrists. Comorbid AvPD and post-traumatic stress disorder. Some avoidants pull back in the here and now to steal themselves from a potential or actual current relationship that reminds them of a traumatic relationship from the past. They confound new people they might love or who might love them with old people whom they loved once, only to discover that in reply they hurt them badly and irrevocably. Unable to discriminate between bad past and good present relationships, they instead continue to generalize from old bad experiences to new, unrelated, good, and potentially satisfying involvements. A case example. As a child, an avoidant was raised in the same bedroom as a delusional grandmother who regularly, and because of her age and status, with some authority, announced that through the window she could see kidnappers, and I worry that they will whisk you away. Later in life, he stayed away from all involvements with people who were overly intense like her. Instead, he preferred people who were bland, unemotional, and uninvolved, which unfortunately and predictably meant that they were also remote. He also had a hypochondriacal father who worried constantly that he might get polio, and even kept him at home for months in quarantine so that he would not come into contact with the polio virus. To ice the cake, as the patient said, he dressed me up in high shoes, like the ones actual polio victims wore, and forced me to wear knickers that had gone out of style and were made out of wool that, because of my allergy to lanolin, itched me so intensely that I could hardly function in social situations, unless I wore shorty pajamas underneath to act as a lining, only to be regularly humiliated when, as predictably happened, my pajamas spontaneously fell down and stuck out from below. Not surprisingly, later in life, the boy developed a pervasive shyness that in effect said, "I am too ashamed of myself to get close to anyone, for if I stay away from people, I won't be dangerously on display and mocked as a result." Comorbid AvPD and paraphilia. Paraphiliac avoidants are disabled in loving because they limit their attraction to the paraphiliac object or situation, one that, by definition, represents only part of normative patterns of arousal and activity. An example is an over-fondness for a particular body part, such as a food. For paraphiliac avoidance, the attraction to the part is an aspect of the process of distancing themselves from the whole. Part of the process is that paraphiliac avoidants find themselves compulsively attracted to relationships that are dysfunctional because they are non-reciprocal. Thus, a subway marauder experienced a decrease in sexual arousal when a partner promised, threatened to get close. So he robbed a woman in the subway because with such strangers, a full personal and sexual relationship was completely out of the question. Comorbid AvPD and narcissism. Narcissistic avoidants tend to avoid less out of fear and more out of a preoccupation with their own needs, one that can be selfish in the extreme. Thus, a single man at the beginning of the evening complained to his blind date, "I had to interview 90 women just to get you." And at the end of the evening, "I've dated women with small breasts, and I've dated women with large breasts. But no matter how hard I try, I can't seem to find a woman whose breasts are exactly the right size." Narcissistic avoidants don't get close to and maintain a solid relationship with others because they jealously guard an identity of which they are inordinately fond. They have difficulty giving up being me in order to become us. They feel that who I am, my masculinity, my identity as an independent woman, my emancipated status as a woman, is more important than who I am with. They are entirely too willing to stand on principle, even though that means standing alone. Comorbid AvPD and passive aggression. Passive-aggressive avoidants antagonize others in subtle ways. Their goal is to provoke others to withdraw from them in a way that allows them to deny that they are the ones orchestrating the withdrawal from others. Comorbid AvPD and aggressive personality disorder. The same avoidant individual can be and often is both afraid of criticism and highly judgmental and critical of others. A case example. One aggressive avoidant had few friends or lovers because, as she herself complained, she couldn't keep from criticizing everyone she knew, both for things beyond their control, like their looks, financial status, and emotional problems, and for things within their control, but essentially unimportant, like wearing yesterday's clothes or recommending and taking her to all the wrong places. For example, she was very close to a colleague for many years, until that colleague got slightly depressed and needed someone to talk to, at which time she told her, "I am not interested in doing therapy with my friends," and refused ever to see her again. She also often criticized people for things that were her own fault. For example, utterly shattered over having missed the bus stop, though the next stop was only a few blocks away. She found herself severely castigating the bus driver for not reminding her to get off, even though, assuming incorrectly, he knew her from earlier trips. She had not bothered to tell him the location of her stop. She often attacked innocent people just because they were around and available to be savaged. Sometimes it was the messenger, sometimes it was the next person to come along after the last person who troubled her. And sometimes it was the repairman who was trying to fix the problem. For example, she excoriated the bus driver of the bus that came for there being so few buses, because she was angry at the driver of the bus that did not come. She excoriated an airline ticket agent when her luggage was lost, although it was the person who handled the luggage, not the ticket agent, who, if any abuse were deserved, was the one who merited it. Finally, she often went back in time to tease out one thread from the skein of life's normal give and take, stretch the simple, unremarkable strand, and weave it into a tapestry horrific enough to give her the reason she needed to act out negative feelings about potentially positive relationships. Thus, after 43 years of not seeing a childhood companion, she was reintroduced to him at a large party she gave, whereupon she spontaneously announced, loudly and unforgivingly, and to all present, "Here is the boy who, when we were both 2 years old, threw dirt in my carriage." Comorbid AvPD and passive-dependent personality disorder. Some type 2C passive-dependent avoidants actively surround themselves with a protective shell to effectively hide out from a world they perceive to be threatening and rejecting. They do this by forming a possibly unhealthy dependent relationship with one to avoid having healthy relationships with many. They might become overly close to a parent to avoid having a lover, or to avoid having to go to work, or form an overly close codependent relationship with a single partner to avoid other outside relationships. Some seek safety by becoming dependent on groups of like-minded avoidants. On the positive side, these groups enhance self-esteem through imparting a sense of belonging that makes all concerned feel wanted and involved. On the negative side, by becoming overly possessive, they enhance pathological intragroup attachments that isolate the group members from the outside world. Other passive dependent avoidants are simply too inactive to actively relate to others, for that means doing the work required to meet someone like Mr. or Miss Right. I advised one patient from northern New Jersey, desperate for but unable to meet a partner, to go to New York and try hanging around a special place where bachelors go to meet women. In response, he could do no better than complain. Too far, too hard to get there. In still other cases, the passivity is not the cause, but rather the result of the primary avoidant problem. One avoidant, afraid that being active could lead to being rejected, refused to follow her friend's advice to be more forward with men. For example, when a man she liked said goodbye to her, ignoring her friend's advice to say, "I won't let you get away until I get your phone number," she merely said goodbye back and let it go at that. In her case, it was guilt and shame about her humanity that led her to hold back, for she believed that simply acting interested in a man meant that she was proposing to have an illicit liaison with him. When passive avoidants like her find themselves in a troubled relationship, they tend to both welcome the troubles and make little or no active attempt to fix them. Typically, they ask or allow others to take full responsibility for the outcome of their lives, deputizing virtual strangers into telling them what to do. Rather than looking for problems and coming up with solutions on their own, they write letters to newspaper columnists or to me asking, "What do you think I should do?" or find therapists who tell them whether to stay or go. Predictably, they select that columnist or therapist they know intuitively, by reputation, or from past experience will encourage them to leave. Then they lead them on by only giving them information that would seem to suggest that they should go, and censoring information that might suggest they should stay. On a more favorable note, passive dependents are non-avoidant when they suppress their hostility in order to maintain their dependency. They act kind when we would expect them to be unkind, say it doesn't matter when they should be setting limits, say yes when they should be saying no, suppress their sexuality should they deem it somehow troublesome to others, and generally behave in a self-sacrificial fashion, all in order to avoid offending others in a way that might lead others to retaliate by rejecting and dismissing them. Comorbid AvPD and masochism. Non-masochistic avoidants want to relate well in order to avoid personal distress. In contrast, masochistic avoidants want to relate poorly in order to induce personal suffering. Some, looking to relate to people who cannot or will not relate to them, deliberately extend themselves only to those who are unlikely to accept them. Disinterested in people who overlook their flaws or see them as virtues, and wanting most of all to get approval from someone who already disapproves of them, they become unaccountably attracted to and actively seek out critical, humiliating, and rejecting persons, or at the very least choose those who are too different from them to be sufficiently compatible to make suitable companions and partners. When these relationships fail to hurt and punish them as hoped and expected, they arrange to hurt and punish themselves through these relationships. After seeking them out, they stick with unfulfilling people and make a concerted effort to convert their harshest and most disdainful critics. The harsher and more critical, the better, from negative to positive. They willingly, though resentfully, become submissive and do almost anything, even things that are not in their best interests, just to make these relationships work. They even gladly excuse the most outrageous behavior in their partners just so that the relationship can continue, as did the masochistic woman who excused her husband for cursing and reviling her in the foulest of terms on the basis of anyone who hurts another person like that must be in pain himself. And should their relationships threaten to work, they imagine negativity in a neutral or positive situation. A man might call and leave a message for someone on Friday, and forgetting about the weekend, think he was being rejected because the call was not returned until Monday. They look for and find flaws in others because now they can make a cause celebrate out of the deficits, deliberately marrying a relationship that works so that they can give themselves the excuse they are already seeking, not to make repairs but instead to give up and leave. Some case examples. A masochistic bisexual avoidant avoided people who treated him with respect in favor of relating to people who were unpleasant, hurtful, or abusive to him. He shrank from people he sensed would accept and love him by placing ads on the internet and then not replying to respondents who seemed interested in him. He also turned down promising introductions from friends and family who wanted to fix him up when he sensed that the fix might work out. Instead, he felt most strongly attracted to remote women, prostitutes in particular. In an attraction to heterosexual prostitutes, the money transfer was avoidant because it convinced him, "I don't love, I buy." In a sideline attraction to transgender prostitutes, he knowingly involved himself in a situation where confusion precluded closeness. For the prostitutes, the avoidant attraction often was, "I do it with many people, not one, and not for love, but for money," which both precluded closeness and provided them with an opportunity for expression of hostility toward people who can't get it but have to buy it. A masochistic single woman came to me complaining of a burgeoning successophobia, typified in a recurrent dream that my driving phobia, a symptom of which she long complained in reality, had lifted enough for me to be able to drive. But when I tried to park the car, I would swing it widely and into traffic, bumping, hitting, and destroying other cars in the process. When speaking of her relationships, she complained, "I have searched the world, and there is no one in it for me." I suggested she ask her relatives, who knew many eligible bachelors, to fix her up with blind dates. They did, and the dates were not bad. But to defeat herself, her relatives, and me, she announced, "Blind dates never work out," and refused to accept ever being fixed up again. For her, blind dates got an undeservedly bad reputation because, as a masochistic avoidant, she needed to be certain that no relationship would ever develop. To that end, she saw to it that her self-destructive behavior continued into the blind date itself. Drawing additional inspiration from a successophobic belief that what was bad for her was good for her, and the reverse, she made a masochistic choice in her final selection of the man who was to be her husband. As she put it, looking back, "I avoided all the attractive men I met. Instead, I married the man who was unattractive, impotent, thin, reserved, self-preoccupied, and mother-fixated. Later, after meeting her goal of getting married to a man she found unattractive, she was actually surprised, as if she were learning it for the first time, that they had nothing in common, or that, as she put it in more specific sexual terms, his penis doesn't fit in my vagina. After some years of couple treatment, she decided to try to get along with him. He's really not a bad guy, she finally admitted. But then a new symptom arose, her 7-year itch. Unlike non-masochistic avoidance, in whom the 7-year itch is a longing for variety, originating partly in a sense of boredom that can be reality-based, her 7-year itch appeared precisely in order to disrupt a relationship that was finally going well. Her husband had begun to respond to her positively, surprising her by becoming loving, just the way she once thought she had always wanted him to be, but which now turned her off completely. Many avoidants act out as masochistically with place as they do with person. In a self-destructive geographical maneuver, they choose to live in a place where they sense they are not wanted and can never be happy. They have a civil right to be there, but more important, because they did not fit in, they get stuck in what is for them a hopelessly de-affirming culture, where they aren't nearly as happy as they might be in another location, one where they had both a right and a reason to be. In therapy, masochistic avoidants tend to be especially resistant to improvement. They find ways to keep their avoidance in order to continue their suffering. They call their loneliness preferential and attempt to convince their therapist of the same thing. They claim to value their privacy and independence over all else. They say that marriage isn't right for everyone and is not right for me. They note that having regular sex is not all it is cracked up to be. In the words of one such avoidant, the best things in life are only for the isolate. Should therapy appear to be working, they find a way to defeat it by having a masochistic triumph that consists of cutting off their noses to spite their therapist's face. This was the motivation of an unmarried woman who allowed her goal of meeting people to become secondary to her goal of proving to everyone trying to help her, family, friends, and me, that no matter what I do, I still can't find Mr. Right, and no matter what you do, you still can't help me catch him. Not surprisingly, in couple therapy, masochistic avoidants respond negatively when a partner improves. In their headlong rush to a painful divorce, they deliberately, if unconsciously, continue to view a mate who has newly become interesting as still boring, who has learned to be nice as still insufficiently positive for their taste, and who has changed from remote to close as a newly developing threat to their valued freedom, independence, and identity. Comorbid AvPD and addiction. Avoidants who are also addicts gamble or take drugs as a substitute for having relationships. For example, they gamble not to be involved with, but to retreat from the world and the people in it via entering the substitutive fantasy arena of the casino. They are figurative opium den. A man gambled in Las Vegas to get away from his wife. He thought of himself as a guest of the owner of his favorite casino, as if the owner wanted not his money, but him personally. He viewed the casino as the perfect home with the perfect people in it. in contrast to my own shabby surroundings and impossible home life. As anyone who has tried to make eye contact with a serious gambler in a casino can attest, he, like many gamblers, hardly noticed anyone around him. He was blocking out the possibility that someone might be interested in him, personally or sexually, as if the gambling as intended made human relationships, at least for the moment, entirely beside the point. Comorbid AvPD and bisexuality. Bisexual avoidants indulge in types 2A and 2B avoidant behavior when they behave homosexually to avoid heterosexuality and the other way round. A case example. A patient was at first a heterosexually oriented child, but as he recalled, because he threw a baseball underhanded, his peers humiliated him to the point that his self-esteem fell precipitously. So, as an adult, he became bisexual to protect myself from rejection and the consequent loss of self-esteem by surrounding myself with two different kinds of people and fleeing protectively from one to another whenever I felt criticized and humiliated. He also traced the origin of his bisexual shifting to problems in his early relationship with his parents. According to him, an over-attachment to and identification with his mother fostered homosexual fantasies, as he acted toward male companions in a way that reproduced his mother's seductive behavior towards him. But heterosexual fantasies came to the fore as he fled from homosexual relationships because they made him feel too much like a woman and so much too much like his mother. Also, every time a woman was unpleasant to him, she sent me to men because she reminded him of his mother's hostility toward him, while every time a woman was warm or seductive toward him, she sent me to men because she aroused Oedipal or incestuous anxiety related to my mother's fixation. He also traced his bisexual shifting back to his relationship with his father. He believed that his complete disrespect for his father put a damper on his heterosexuality because he had no male figure to identify with, and a restitutive need for a good father accounted for his never-ending search for an imperfect man he could make over into an ideal male parent. As he concluded overall, I use my bisexuality to reduce anxiety about getting close to any one individual, for my being bisexual means that I will never be stuck in one place and with one person only. Comorbid AvPD and mixed personality disorder. I diagnosed the following individual as a man with avoidant, including sexually avoidant, passive-aggressive, and narcissistic personality features. I recently was given your book as a gift, and I must say that I find some parts of it very helpful in my situation. I have spent hundreds on counselors in the past few months and have not received any direction from them on understanding why I do the things I do and what I can do to change. Your book has helped me get a better understanding of who I am, and I must say I do not like myself for it. My story goes like this. I was with my wife for 7 years, and for the first part, everything was fine. We moved in together after 6 months. 3 months afterward, my sister moved in with us, arriving on a student visa from Greece. She interfered all the time with my relationship with my wife, and it became too tiring to deal with her, as she had issues of her own. She was 30 when she arrived. She is now 36. This took a toll on my relationship with my wife. Yet I was unwilling to tell my sister she had to go home, then kick her out. She would sign up for college courses in English as a second language and just not go. She needed to be enrolled in a class to keep her visa. She would go once a week to make an appearance, then spend the rest of her time sleeping during the day and staying up all night watching TV or cooking. When my wife learned I was the one paying for all my sister's expenses and she had sucked up all my savings, she asked me why I needed to support my sister like this and said she was using me. I explained it was a cultural thing and she would not understand. Around the same time, I got money from my parents to buy a new home. My wife and I found a nice loft in Center City, but I insisted we get a 2-bedroom to accommodate my sister. We all moved in, and things got worse. The 2-bedroom was an open concept with wall partitions going up 8 feet, while the ceiling height was 14 feet. So you could hear every sound. Our sex life went from very little to even more so. We were never really that sexually compatible to begin with, since my wife was more the romantic type that needed candles flickering and soft music playing in the background, while I was more spontaneous and aggressive and liked to be adventurous. As our sex life became worse, I got to the point that I was more into porn than into her. I would rather just lie beside her and relieve myself than do anything. And if she tried to touch me, I would push her away, and this even when my sister was not home. I would not let her have me unless I was drunk or high, and she was not into that, as she said she would feel she was taking advantage of me and making me do something I did not enjoy. My wife got sick of the situation and started to hook up with other guys on the side. She learned that with others, she could have the sex she wanted and enjoyed, the sex that she could never get from me. Spring last year, we decided to move to a new place with more privacy. My wife begged me to get rid of my sister, and I kept telling her that since my parents gave me the money for the place, I did not want to do that, even though our parents also wanted my sister to go back home and live her life there, and my sister owns her own place back in Greece. My wife got to a point where she felt alone because she was in a miniature relationship with me and my sister. My wife also complained that she put all the money she made into our home, yet every day she would come home to find the house a complete mess, as my sister would do nothing around the house but cook a meal she saw on a cooking show that day. My wife begged me to do something, but I refused, as I said that it is not her house, as my parents gave me the money for it. I told her that this was not her home, even though everything she made went toward it. She began to feel like she was working towards nothing in her future. She even started contemplating suicide. She had enough. She had to get away, so she flew to London for a week to clear her mind and distance herself from the relationship to evaluate what she should do. She came back with as few answers as she had when she left. When she returned, she connected with a guy, John, that she thought was very nice even though he was 11 years older. They started talking and got to know each other well. They hooked up and she said that the sex was the best she ever had. Next, she decided she had had enough of being the third person in her marriage and moved out and in with John. She knew this was not the brightest of ideas, but she felt like she finally met someone that she could connect with on all levels of a relationship, and she was not willing to pass up the opportunity to be happy for once. So 4 months ago, she filed for a divorce. It was only then that I finally sent my sister packing for home and begged my wife to come back home and work out our problems. During that time, though, she fell hard for John, and they seemed to have a great relationship. The exception is that John gets mad that my wife and I still have a business and work together. My wife feels torn. While now I would like to have an exclusive relationship with her, she is unsure of what to do. I feel like after all those years of my being stuck with my sister from hell, she should give me a second chance and try to work out things with me. I know she is cheating on me, and while I am willing to forgive, I would be unwilling to open up the relationship since I go for exclusivity. On the other hand, she says her relationship with John is great. Sexually, things are fantastic, and it all just feels right for her without her having to try. So reading your book made me feel like I'm behaving inadequately. I have tried to get professional help for this to get her back. The situation is driving me to the point where I do not know what to do. If you could tell me what to do, I would forever be in your debt.